this is John from the Accountability Buddies podcast. Figured I'd give a little bit of demonstration about how I paint my blues. And so today I'm going to go through, kind of the prep work and some of the things I do for the work that I do to get the kind of unique ultramarine blue that I get on a lot of my guys. The first thing I do is I always prime my stuff black. I like the Vallejo black primer that you can airbrush, but I've found that sometimes I'm just, most of the time I'm in a rush to get this stuff done. As you know, I like to crank out a lot of stuff as fast as possible. And so my goal, what I end up using is the Vallejo spray primer. It's exactly the same formula as the one that comes in the airbrush. It's just a lot quicker to apply. And so that's what I do here is I double-sided tape all my stuff to these rulers. I usually just buy bulk rulers from the dollar store whenever I can find them there. And then go ahead and prime things. Prime from the bottom, prime from the sides, prime left, prime right. Y'all know how to apply primers. Once you've got that set up, then you want to go ahead and do zenithial highlighting. And so zenithial highlighting, what I do is I have my favorite white is this Medea Com Art white. You can kind of see this one's a little bit beat up, so you can't read it as well, so I'll get the big bottle here. Oh, that one's kind of faded too. But it's an opaque white. It is perfectly thinned, right to use straight out of the bottle. I just drop a few drops in, and then I go ahead and start applying it. What I'm trying to do with this highlight on figures is I'm trying to obviously establish lights and shadows and how that works. So if you're doing figures, obviously you want to kind of pick an angle for that light to come in. But if you're doing vehicles, like I'm trying to do today, what you're going to do is kind of apply volumetric lighting to a lot of the areas where you just kind of want to create interest in the piece. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and drop some of this in there. That's probably going to be more than enough that we need. Close that off. All right, and so what I'm going to do is, usually I like to do these separately, but again, because these are just hatches, I really don't have that much of a care about them, so I'm just going to go ahead and create a quick white on here. So you can see there, I'm trying to create the top of this as being bright white, this first pass. When you're thinking about a tank, the one thing that'll draw your eye, on a figure, the human eye is drawn immediately to the face, but on a tank, the human eye is going to usually be drawn to cool features like the gun or a commander or anything that kind of sticks out as far as not just bland armor. And so with these, I'm applying that white on top. I'm not doing anything on the back because it's really not going to have that much variation in color. And so I'm just making sure that I'm nice and bright white, coming from the same angle each time, because these are going each direction. I'm going to have to kind of flip this back and forth. And so those are just the storm bolters done real quick like. Next up, we'll do the missiles. And these are 3D prints I picked up off of Etsy. I want to use these missile parts as the main reason I bought them, to keep track of my hunter-killer missiles for my saber tanks. And so I'm just going to magnetize these at the top. And so I'm going to use the solid ones here as unfired, and then these kind of Robotech looking one as fired missiles. And so I'm just going to do the same thing I just did to those. So we're going to put a nice white spot on top. And then I'm going to put a white against the other edge. So what I'm doing is now you're thinking, well, that's not really how light works, and you're absolutely correct. What I'm doing is I'm creating visual interest on these panels, and I want to make sure that I've got differentiation between these. You don't want to, as much as possible, you don't want to have bright pieces next to each other so they're meeting up. A little bit of dry tip there, so what I do is I usually just keep my t-shirt or paper towel handy, and so can't really see it that well, but there's a little bit of paint nubbed up on the end there, and so I just go in and pinch that, pull it down, and then I'm back to spraying semi-decently. Again, these are hatches. I'm not really that worried about how they're going to come out as far as quality of super neatness or not. And these missiles, I'm going to probably start doing some washes on those. I don't know if I spray these. And so we'll give a little highlight there. And so I'm just doing, again, real quick highlights, making sure that I've got some variation established on these hatches. If I see any areas where it looks a little thin, I go back in with a second coat. I'm not spinning super long on these because, again, they're hatches. They're not going to be used all that often. They're just here for me to have extra parts. Now, because we are using an airbrush, I really don't like to save paint if I mix too much in there, so I just go ahead and dump it. I'll come back in just a second, and we'll talk about, after I've got that zenithal highlight set up, then we'll go ahead and look at how I apply blues, and that'll be in the next video. Okay, so the first step with blues for my Ultramarines is I use Ultramarines Blue Vallejo Game Air, and so you can see real quick on what I did with these hatches that we were talking about just a second ago. But when it comes to real vehicles, let's pull one of those out so you can see what the highlights looks like. So this is a Spartan that I went ahead and talked about on the podcast. And so I've got the interior all painted up, so I've got this door sealed. I've gone through and added silly putty here to cover up the low panels because I like my low panels to stay white. So I'm just using that highlight that I applied as my white coloring for those panels, and I just filled it in with silly putty. Silly putty is probably one of the best masking materials you can get for your money. They make camouflage putty and things like that, and I do enjoy those for other things, but if I'm just filling in panels like this, silly putty works really well. You can leave it on there for months, and I have done that before between projects. I accidentally left some silly putty on for a long time, and you can even see there's a little bit of blue flecks in there because I've reused this silly putty over and over and over again, and there is no real limit that I've found to how many times you can reuse silly putty. So you can see what I've done is I've got the white highlights up here on the turrets and the hatches, because that's where your eye is going to get drawn to. What I'll do now is I'll kind of do a quick airbrush, and I'm sure Jack's will be real nice and speed up the video for me while that happens. One thing I do when I'm airbrushing vehicles is, you're always going to have the fact that the undersides of vehicles really aren't going to be seen, and so in that instance you can kind of use that to your advantage, because you know that if you have any runs and things like that, it's easier to repair those as you're painting. And so what I do when I'm painting vehicles is I always start painting them upside down, and so I try to go through and paint it as fairly straightforward as possible, just painting everything I can. I don't necessarily worry about getting up underneath parts. So for instance, you can see here I'll paint this leading edge here, but I won't worry about getting up underneath this part on this first pass through. And then as I go through, I'll finish it off, and then once it's dry enough, I flip it over and then finish it off. This way, if you do have any runs or any freakouts while you're painting, you can go back through and kind of fix some of those issues as they go through. The other thing that I really use for a lot of my airbrushing are these little funnels with a strainer in the bottom of it. Micromark sells these. You really only need one set, and just kind of rinse it off as you go along, making sure that you don't have to worry about getting any goo in the bottom of your airbrush, and then you have to go ahead and clean it out. This is the smallest one that comes in the set, and I've used it now for almost 6 or 7 years now, and I just rinse it out as I'm painting and then keep going along. That Medea Comart White, I don't run through this because it's so formulated, so thin, but anything else that I've mixed or that it says it's, anything that I have to mix that isn't straight airbrush ready, I go ahead and put through this, or if I've had a paint that's had some clogging issues before, through a certain line, I go ahead and put through this into the airbrush. and then rinse it off. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, you don't want to overly layer this down. You don't want it so thick that it's going to run on you. But you do kind of want to make sure that you've got a decent color through here. I do go ahead and come back through later with a highlight color, and so that way I can come through and not have to worry about overexposing things or trying to reestablish shadows. Again, I'm trying to do these fairly quickly to a nice scheme. My Ultramarines win a couple of awards, but they're not, going to draw golden demons or things like that. They're just good battle-ready troops. And you can see as we're painting through here that white that we put underneath is really already establishing our highlights on here. So I'm not going to have to do a ton of over highlighting with the next color. So turn the tank. The other thing I'm watching out for is you'll notice I'm kind of trying to stay away from that door. Even though it is sealed up, I don't know where air is going to get in and different cracks and things like that. So I'm trying to keep as much away from that seam right there as I can. So now that it's starting to get wet, I'm going to actually pick up the tray instead of picking up the tank itself. That way I don't have to worry about fat fingering something as I go along. Notice some spots that didn't get quite as nicely covered as I like. What we're really trying to do now is just really get rid of the white highlight color. I'm not trying to paint this so much that I have a uniform blue. I want to keep a lot of those highlights and lowlights that I've established with that white earlier. But I don't want to have any bright spotlight white spots. And you can see I'm not putting a ton of paint down in some of the darker areas like some underneath the tracks here. I'm just trying to get a blue tint to it, not a straight blue. Looks good. I'll go ahead and flip it over. So I just finished on this side, which means this side should be dry now. And so that's one of the bonuses of kind of painting this thing as you go around it, is you'll know that each section should be dry by the time you get back around to it. And I get that door done first, so that way I don't have to worry as much about trying to get blue paint seepage into my nice interior. And then we'll go back over here. So I'm not having to do a ton of paint on this. I'm just trying to put the color, the side that I didn't get from the other angle. So with that black and white, just applying a slight thin coat of blue, the white will make it highlight and the black will keep it kind of dark in the recesses. So I'm not having to put down a ton of blue everywhere. I'm just trying to make sure I've got a blue tint to everything before I worry about moving on to my next colors. Another quick pass on things. I'm honestly using more air than paint right now on a couple spots. Ooh, looks like I got a little bit of run right there. Okay, so I'm going to have some weathering on this guy up on top of the hatch. Now I'm just kind of doing a straight air to kind of dry that out a little quicker. Add some more colors around it because it looks like Didn't quite get that white covered. Okay, the next color is going to be my Ultramarines blue highlight. And let me get another previously done tank so you can kind of see what that looks like side by side. Here's one of my Ultramarine Whirlwinds. You can see that they almost look the same, except this has some little highlighted, more highlight in some of the areas, and that comes from the, like I said, the Ultramarines blue highlight from Vallejo Air. There's also Reaper Triads makes an Ultramarines highlight. I think it's a little bit too dark, and so I usually just end up mixing my own and putting a big H on the side of it. Before I go ahead and spray that down. And then what I do afterwards is if I've blown out the highlights too much, then I can tone everything back down with an Ultramarines blue ink that I've found from Winsor & Newton that really kind of pulls everything together. You know, if you're into photography, you know, the filter is something you put over the lens to kind of give everything a nice tint to it. You've probably seen it in movies where, you know, everything in Mexico is a brown, everything in Canada is kind of a blue. You can do the same thing with your miniatures, is trying to tie all those colors together. So in this instance, if I've not highlighted things enough or I've overblown my base coat, I can go ahead and come back in with that Ultramarines blue highlight, and if that's a little too far even then I have another ability to step it back down. So each one of these processes allows you to kind of backtrack and pull everything back together without having to worry about completely scrapping your project and starting back over from the beginning. So I'll be recording those a little bit later. Thank you, Jack. Okay, so now that I've got my base coat down, Ultramarines blue down on all my tanks, I went ahead and pulled out one of my older tanks. This is a de-plague-ified plague crawler that I'm going to use as my bombards while they still have rules. And so I pulled this out to make sure that the Ultramarines blue that I'm painting on the tanks is going to match the tanks, the older tanks. I didn't do this for one of my Steps of Marines, and they ended up a little more purple. And so now I always make sure that I have at least one of the last batch of Marines that I painted nearby, so that way I can at least kind of compare. And so you can see here, this tank has a little bit higher highlights and a little bit deeper shadow. So that means I went ahead and pushed my highlights up a little bit more, and then went ahead and did that all over filter like I was talking about earlier. And so I've gone ahead and pulled out my console blue from Vallejo, and I'm going to go ahead and airbrush this on some of the high points on this guy just to push them a little bit brighter, and then I'll go ahead and do that filter all over to pull everything down together. And so let's go ahead and just do that real quick with any luck. Because of the way these are done, I'm not going to do a ton of highlights on these tanks because they're just, there's not a ton of eye pop to them. You know, you want to make sure that they're, you know, kind of run-of-the-mill tanks. So there we go. And so again, I want to this in a little bit. Cupolas are going to be my main point. On this side, we'll go ahead and just highlight that door some. Like I said, I'm not doing a ton on these. I just want to make a little bit of highlights on them, so I kind of draw that attention to these doors, to the big gun there, and to the cupola. I think that's going to do it for this one. So we'll move on to the next step. Okay, welcome back for the last part here. Dust on there. Okay, so you can see I've gone ahead and applied that highlight color on there. I've got nice doors picked out. I've got these little armor bits picked out, and I've got the side doors picked out. what I do now is I take my, oh dear, this is upside down. Oh, crap. Okay. Well, hopefully Jack can fix this because I'm not going to fix it. So you can see here I've got my highlights applied to my hatches, armor panels, and my side doors there. So after that's done, now we want to pull everything together. Again, we're just trying to tint this whole thing and pull it all down together, you know, like you see in movies. I use this Winsor & Newton Ultramarines blue ink. And it seems like it's kind of focusing there. It's just got a little boy wearing a blue Ultramarine suit, jumper thing, standing on a, I guess that's an island. It's really weird. It's Winsor & Newton. I don't know. I don't get paid to market this crap. But I went ahead and thinned it down really well. It's really like a kind of like a glaze, but I'm shooting it through an airbrush. You can see I mix up quite a big batch of this stuff, thin it down really well, and I go ahead and try it out on a card here so I can see what it's going to come out looking like. Get this the white balance in here is a little weird. I'm still kind of working on that, but after I've got that thinned up, I really just coat this whole thing with it. Obviously take this nice and slow since it's super thin. It's going to want to pool, so you're going to want to keep an eye on it as we go. Blow just straight air through there to try to get that little spot at the bottom. I hope you can see that's kind of reacting to me. The doors a little bit. And again, these are tanks, so you can always weather them up a little bit if you don't like the way that that's coming out. Like before, I always try to do opposite sides first. That way I got something to grab onto. Start at the top and work down. That way if there are runs, you can work through them. And now I'm just coming back with air again to make sure that everything's drying right. You can see this is that side we worked on earlier. There's a little bit of splatter there, but again, this is a tank, so I can just go through and decals are next, so I can either cover those spots up with decals or I can weather it. Air. I do have a hair dryer set up on the side of my spray booth that I can use, but it's a little hard to hear over, considering right now that that's loud enough. Get that compressor going. See, as this dries, we're really tying everything together. You don't have as much blown out look from the panels that we had earlier. And if you're on the sides, you can see they almost really blend together. You've got kind of almost a highlight just looks like natural lighting. So I'm just kind of pulling everything together again. Just that's what this is for. It's just a simple filter, just like they do with different areas of color grading for movies and things like that. So you can just think of this as a kind of a slightly colored saran wrap over everything. But that's pretty much everything I do for painting my basic blues. Next step is going to be obviously taking off the silly putty masking that I've done there, and then gloss coating everything so that we can do decals. And then after the decals are done, then I re-gloss coat to protect them, and then I flat coat, and then I start picking out spot colors and moving forward. And what I'll be doing with these tanks is I'm actually going to do a decal kind of a decal how-to as well coming up next after this is done. And then I'll continue along with these tanks and kind of show different videos on how I do my Marines. So I hope you all have enjoyed this journey with me through the Accountability Buddies over the last, for me it was a few days, for you all it's probably not going to be that long with Mr. Jack editing all this down for me. But thank you very much for watching today, and I appreciate everything. And if you've got any questions, feel free to hit me up on the show chat or send us an email on something I'm sure Jack will just put on the screen right now. And thank you very much. Talk to you later. Okay. Everybody gone? Alright, now time for some post-credits peel porn. I've always thought it was really cool to watch these white parts reveal themselves. Now, you probably noticed that these aren't exactly perfect. Again, that's going to happen sometimes if you don't take time and kind of do it quickly like I do sometimes. You can go back in there with a brush with your base coat color and kind of touch that up. Or, like I said earlier, that's what weathering is for. There's not going to be a ton of white on these vehicles, mainly because there's not a whole bunch of recessed parts, but I do like the way this recessed white panels looks on my other vehicles, so I went ahead and added it to these. I'm trying a new one with this right here. I do kind of like the way that looks. That looks pretty hot. And let's flip it over to the other side. And again, because this is silly putty, once you get it started, it really just all kind of comes off there. And this can all be reused. Doesn't matter how blue it is, how much contamination you get. I've never had silly putty that refuses to work. There we go. Stay tuned for the decals coming soon.